Welcome back, Water Resources students. We're here for the final lecture in our Watershed Factors module. And what I want to do here is sort of end um, with an overview of the types of ecosystems and physical habitats that exist in watersheds. Um, so here's a cartoon diagram of a watershed where we've got some streams. We've got some streams and some tributary streams. We've got lakes. Everything flows to an ocean. We've got different land uses, forested, maybe agriculture, prairie over here, things like that. We've got bedrock, so we've got some infiltration, and there would be some interflow laterally or parallel to the land surface, some deeper percolation to groundwater, and all that. All the things we talked about elsewhere in this lecture and also in previous modules. So in these watersheds, we have different habitats if we speak in just general terms. We have some terrestrial habitats. These are habitats that are on the land. So these wouldn't be aquatic, but they're habitats within the watershed. I mean, unless you are a marine critter that lives out here in the ocean, you live in a watershed. We all live in a watershed, and that includes all the animals except for whales and sharks and stuff that live in oceans. We would have some wetlands out here. Maybe the wetlands would be around the lake or next to streams or just in prairies. We have our groundwater aquifer, and I know you probably think, well, that's underground, but there are critters that live in that habitat. We have surface water, so our lakes and our streams, and they have their own ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems that live there, things like fish. And then the hyporheic zone. You may not have heard about this one. The hyporheic zone is sort of it's in the stream corridor, but it's sort of the area around and underneath the channel. And I'll explain that a little more in an upcoming slide. All right, let's talk about land use changes. In the previous lecture, we sort of took a deep dive on some hypothetical hydrographs um, that related to different land uses, but let's talk about what the history of the US is. So if you were here in 1620, sort of basically before European settlement, almost everything east of the Mississippi River was forested. Everything in the Great Plains in the central part of the US were prairies, and a lot of those prairies were um, wetlands that stored lots of water. It's relatively flat. Water would accumulate in these wetlands. They were great big sponges and then drain slowly through rivers. The Rocky Mountains, the mountainous areas tended to be forested as you get further west. The basin and range here, sort of Nevada, Southern California, um, Western Arizona, those were mostly desert areas out there, so not a ton of vegetation. Then the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, actually rainforest, temperate rainforest there. Um, if we look at what's happened in the US today, we've made a lot of big changes. There's still a lot of forested area here east of the Mississippi River, but we've also cut down a lot of those forests, replaced them with agricultural landscapes. A lot of the middle part of the US, the Great Plains, the southern and northern Great Plains, the Midwest, have been converted from forest or prairie to agriculture. So all those prairie wetlands are basically gone for the most part. The prairies are gone for the most part, and almost everything in this middle part are ranches and farm fields for growing crops. Um, we've maybe had a little bit less influence on the vegetation out west, other than uh, probably the forests have grown a little thicker in the places where they were, and because we've suppressed fire and other land management things like that. Also, climate's affected what grows where a little bit. You'll see here that earlier, even up to the 1920s, there wasn't much forest out here in the basin and range of Nevada, but even some of those areas, because of fire suppression, other management decisions humans have made, we've had some increase in forest there. But the forest map in 2006 is pretty similar to the forest map in 1620, with some important but minor changes over time. So that means we've changed a lot of terrestrial and aquatic habitats. We've changed the distribution of wetlands. We've changed in this Midwestern part of the U.S., the Great Plains and the Midwest, where we've gotten rid of prairies and replaced them with agricultural fields. We've also put drain tile in, and there are many, many, many more times, many, many more miles of streams in some of these areas than there were previous, because where there used to be wetlands, there were just water sort of sat there in big soggy swampy areas. Now that's been channelized and there's a channel there and all the water can drain so that we can do agriculture. We had to get rid of all that soupy swampy area. So here's an example of a wetland. Some places you've got standing water, other places it's sort of soggy vegetation or soggy soil. That's what a wetland is. The water just sort of sits there, drains very slowly. But if you want to grow farm fields here, if you want to put farm fields in, you need to come in here and dig a channel out, and then you put in drain tiles, which are just pipes underground to help all the water that's saturating these soils drain out to that new channel you put in. So basically what you do is you install a man-made river, and that river efficiently drains all the water that otherwise would just stand here so that the soil dries out and you can grow crops. But those wetlands were an important habitat, and unfortunately a lot of those have been lost. Here's a map from 1998 of the approximate distribution of large wetlands in the US, and what you can see is they still exist, but probably a lot of this central area pre-settlement would have been green or wetlands on this map. And then look at Alaska, which is for the most part untouched, especially in the northern parts. There are people there, but we haven't changed land uses significantly. There aren't that many people. That's probably a lot what the Midwest would have looked like in terms of the distribution of wetlands. And so we talked about tile drainage, and here's a diagram on the left here that shows you put these pipes in. They're called tiles underground. These could be anywhere from a few inches in diameter to a couple of feet in diameter. And usually they're sort of a trunk system where you got a main tile that's going to be large, and you get tributary tiles that are smaller diameter to come into those, and those might have their own tributary tiles. And the idea is this would have been wetlands and saturated soil. You put the tile in there, that gives an efficient pathway to drain this water out of the soil, and then that tile drains into a nearby stream. Because a lot of the Great Plains didn't have these streams, it was just one big wetland. We've had to dig these channels out, we've had to build these channels, and then we fill them with the water draining from the soils in these fields. This is a map of Minnesota, but it's representative of a lot of the states in the Midwest and the Great Plains where we converted prairie to ag. All the red streams here are these tiled channels, these man-made tile drainages. The green are the natural streams, and the purple are impoundments. So that's lakes and other things like that that have been man-made. But you see, like, there's just a lot of red on this map. Those are all miles of streams that didn't exist pre-settlement. So I don't know the exact number, it's going to vary state to state, but there might be double or triple the stream miles. The miles of streams in a state like Minnesota might be double, triple, quadruple what it was pre-settlement. It doesn't matter what the exact number is, the point is a lot more stream channel than there used to be because of all these man-made artificial channels. This is an aerial photo from someplace in Kansas, apparently Midland, Kansas, and they had just installed tile on this field, and because it was just installed, you can still see the trenches that they dug the trenches and then they installed the tiles in that, and you can see it's sort of mimics a natural stream pattern other than normal streams would meander, and these tributaries are straight and they go in, and then the smaller tributaries join into a bigger tributary joins into an even bigger one, and all that water is drained out here to that channel or ditch. And that makes this field farmable. Without those tile drains, these fields would be too saturated with water most years to get a tractor in to do the field work, to plant the crop, to harvest the crop, to spray the crop, and so forth. So I'm not necessarily criticizing tile. I mean, we all need to eat, so ag is important, and we need to grow the food that we need to eat. And it's an important part of our economy in the U.S. and especially in the Midwest and the Great Plains. But the consequence, the trade-off of sort of converting these very fertile prairies to very fertile farmlands is we had to tile drain them and add all these new miles of stream channel that didn't used to exist. And we drained all that water from the soil, and we've changed those land uses and basically lost a huge habitat in the process. Um, so moving from that to natural streams, this is a trout stream. As I've said and implied before, I've done a lot of work in trout streams in Minnesota, so this is one of many trout streams. This is a brown trout, which is a non-native species of trout in these streams. The native species would have been brook trout, but this stream is actually in a trout fishery that's the most productive trout fishery in the world. I know you don't usually think of Minnesota, but southeastern Minnesota and the adjacent part of southwestern Wisconsin and the northeastern part of Iowa, that area is called the driftless area, and that area is, at least as of about 10 years ago, in terms of biological productivity, the most productive trout streams in the world. And these trout fisheries are really important recreationally and economically because of that. And so these are natural spring-fed trout streams. That spring-fed makes them very cold water, which is what trout need. So here we have an aquatic ecosystem. It's not just the trout. The trout need the bugs. So we have tons of bugs growing in these streams that hatch out of the stream as insects into at different times of the year. In fact, if you're a trout fisherman, you keep track of these hatches because you know that when these hatches occur, depending on which species of insect is hatching, is going to be a good time to fish for the trout and things like that. Hyperrhea exchanges. So we talked about the hyperrheic zone. It's sort of a 50-cent word, but the hyperrheic zone is this area that sort of bounds the wetted channels. So it's the combination of the groundwater and the saturated stream sediments that are in the bottom of the valley. So it's and the difference between the hyperrheic zone and true groundwater is the hyperrheic zone is an area where water sort of leaves the stream, goes into the hyperrheic zone, comes back up, leaves it, goes back down. So there's a high connectivity between the water in the hyperrheic zone and the water in the stream channel itself. And so nutrients and other constituents of the water move back and forth very rapidly and constantly between the hyperrheic zone and the water in the stream channel itself. And these hyperrheic zones then, because they're sort of like an ecotone is where two habitats meet, such as an estuary where a river meets the ocean. You get an estuary in between. Anywhere where you get a boundary between two different habitats like that, where you get an ecotone, you tend to get really productive habitats. So the hyperrheic zones are very productive. The critters that live here are obviously living in the interstitial spaces, in those sediments and bedrock and things that are in this zone. Some of those, like fish, can sort of burrow into those sediments and live in there when they need to, and then come back out and live in the stream channel when they need to. And if you think about it, if you walk in a stream channel, you often don't see a ton of fish there. But if you've ever, like when I took stream ecology in grad school, we electrofished the channel. So you put up a net and then you basically shock all the fish with an electrical current in the stream, which temporarily paralyzes them. It doesn't really hurt them. Most of them survive it just fine, but it temporarily paralyzes them. And then you catch all those fish in a net and you count them, and in a really small stream, I mean, a stream that's literally a few feet wide and a few tens of meters of channels, you can get hundreds of fish out of there. You walk that channel before you electrofish it, you might see a few. So a lot of those fish are actually, when you're there, most of the time they're spending a lot of their life history burrowed down into the sediment. Plus the bugs, the insects, the bacteria, all the other